Hey guys, tonight we're gliding back to a city that seems too dreamlike to be real. You're floating through a network of quiet canals under a sky smeared in twilight pink, gliding past gardens that, well, float. Birds flit low across the water, dragonflies zip past your nose, and you can just barely make out rows of corn and marigolds swaying on rafts of greenery. This isn't Venice. This is Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, built right in the middle of a lake. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this place. Between volcanic soil that bites your bare feet, sun that doesn't quit, and gods that expect an offering, or three, it's a miracle anyone managed to grow anything here, let alone build an empire. But they did. Ingeniously. And they did it on water. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Let's build a sleepy little global village in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive not by road, but by causeway-long stone paths that stretch like arms across Lake Texcoco. The city seems to rise from the water temples, and homes standing tall as canoes glide underneath. The lake itself mirrors the sky, so everything feels doubled, a city above a city below. You step from the edge of the causeway onto solid ground, or so you think, until you glance down and realize you're standing on something a little too green. A garden, a field, a raft. Yes, welcome to the Chinampa, the floating garden. Tenochtitlan, founded around 1325, wasn't exactly built in a prime real estate zone. The Mexica people, who would become the Aztecs, were exiles when they arrived, looking for a sign from the gods. The sign was a humble one, an eagle perched on a cactus eating a snake. Romantic, maybe. Practical. Not so much. The spot was smack in the middle of a lake, which, to be fair, had an excellent view, but that didn't make it farmable. You squelch through a patch of damp shoreline, wondering how anything grows here. The air smells like mud and warm reeds. There's a stillness to it, but also a hum frog's distant flute music, the splash of a paddle somewhere behind you. What the Mexica saw wasn't a barren swamp. They saw possibility. They saw something floatable. Historians still argue whether the earliest Chinampas were strictly agricultural or if they began more as makeshift platforms for temporary shelter. But what's clear is that, over time, the system evolved into one of the most productive agricultural methods in the world. That's not exaggeration. Chinampas could yield several crops a year and supported the diets of thousands of people living in the heart of an otherwise unforgiving landscape. You pass a man carefully pruning a flower bed balanced atop a layer of reeds and black lake mud. His feet don't sink. In fact, he barely leaves a footprint. The Chinampa beneath him is solid, almost spongy. And he's smiling like this is the most ordinary thing in the world, because for him it is. He doesn't need a tractor. He has water, sun, mud, and time. One quirky detail catches your eye, a line of little clay figurines tucked along the edge of a garden bed. Frogs, ducks, a jaguar in miniature. Are they toys? Guardian's crop insurance. Aztec style. Scholars are still unsure, though some say these could be offerings to coax fertility from the watery soil. Others think they're just decorations left by bored field hands with too much spare clay. You duck as a canoe skims by its paddler, nodding at you politely. The boat is filled with squash beans and something that looks suspiciously like a bouquet of edible herbs. It smells like summer. This produce hasn't touched dry land in days. It was harvested from the garden it's floating past. Not stored, not packed. Just handed off garden to canoe in one elegant scoop. You begin to understand how a civilization could grow so vast here. The logistics weren't just practical. They were beautiful. There's something oddly peaceful about this setup. No plows, no fences. Just long, narrow islands neatly partitioned by water like pages in a soggy field notebook. And each island tells its own story, what's planted, where what blooms first, which section holds the corn that will be ground into tortillas at sunrise. But here's the wild part. These aren't islands in the usual sense. They're human-made, held in place with a kind of botanical duct tape. The fact that you're not waist-deep in lake water right now is thanks to generations of careful engineering trial and error and a decent amount of, well, mud enthusiasm. And while we're at it, yes, the mosquitoes are real. Even in history's cozy corners, nature gets the last word. You swat lazily at the air and keep walking, or rather wobbling across the springy surface of a chinampa. A heron eyes you. Suspiciously, perhaps wondering if you're about to disturb its lunch. You stop to rest near a small altar covered in marigolds. The air smells like earth and citrus. Someone has left a handful of beans and a smear of pulque, the Aztec equivalent of a sleepy time nightcap. Maybe it's a toast to the lake, or to the god of agriculture, or just to another day without sinking. The sun dips lower. The sky becomes a sheet of warm honey, and shadows stretch across the chinampas like sleepy limbs. You sit at the edge of a garden bed, dangling your fingers into the warm, still water. It feels both ancient and absurdly refreshing. And this is just the beginning. There's still mud to dig crops to plant gods to honor, and thieves feathered and human alike to fend off. But for now, you're simply here on a floating garden, listening to the lake breathe. You wake if you ever truly slept to the soft sound of water lapping gently against the roots of a tree. The garden beneath you hasn't sunk. That's a good sign. But you're still marveling at how it's even here at all. Because let's face it, when the Aztecs first looked out across Lake Texcoco, they weren't greeted with a gardener's paradise. It was a mess. A wet, weedy, brackish marshland with occasional dry patches, each one barely big enough to roll out a sleeping mat. And yet they saw potential. The Mexica weren't the first people to attempt settling in the Valley of Mexico. Far from it. Civilizations like Teotihuacan and the Toltecs had come before, some leaving ruins and others leaving only rumors. But by the time the Mexica arrived, most of the prime land had been taken, or more accurately fiercely claimed, by neighboring city-states, with names that don't exactly roll off the tongue. So when they were offered a swampy, inhospitable stretch of lake, it felt less like a gift from the gods and more like the last seat at the lunch table. You step carefully around a cluster of reeds, noting how the soil beneath is more water than earth. You try to imagine farming here with your bare hands. There's no dry place to sit, no obvious rows to plant in, and the lake keeps trying to reclaim every square inch of usable space. It's basically like trying to start a garden in your bathtub, while someone else is still using the shower. Historians still argue whether the first chinampas were born out of desperation or inspiration. Some think the technique was passed down and adapted from earlier cultures in the valley. Others argue the Aztecs developed their system more or less independently, innovating rapidly because, well, they kind of had no choice. Either way, this marshy start forced creativity, and creativity in the hands of the Mexica turned into empire building. The first step, dealing with the water itself. The lakes in this region weren't just wet, they were moody. Lake Texcoco was brackish in parts, meaning salty. And salty water is famously bad at growing anything other than seaweed and regret. So the Mexica had to pick their spots carefully. They began pushing out into the freshwater fringes, places where springs and runoff from surrounding mountains diluted the salt. You crouch to feel the water, now cool and mostly sweet. It's subtle, but you'd notice the difference if you tried to grow corn here versus just 5 paddle strokes away. They also faced another charming little issue: flooding. Every rainy season, the lake rose dramatically, sometimes swallowing entire patches of land like an over-enthusiastic sponge. So the Aztecs built dikes, giant embankments that separated fresh and brackish water and helped keep the lake's moods in check. One of the most famous was the Dike of Nezahualcoyotl, an engineering marvel, and a name that sounds suspiciously like you'd pull a muscle trying to pronounce it. You peer off into the distance where the remains of that ancient dike would have stood stone-clay reeds, all packed together in a line so long it could have made a Roman road blush. The purpose: to give people like you a chance to plant a chili pepper without needing a flotation device. By now, you've probably noticed that everything here involves layering. Mud over reed mats, water over soil, labor over imagination. It's the Aztec way stack things until they work. Here's a fringe tidbit you might enjoy. There's a theory that some of the earliest Chinampa experiments were actually mobile. Picture it, tiny floating plots pushed around like aquatic wheelbarrows, towed behind canoes, letting farmers chase the sun. The evidence is thin, and historians debate whether it was practical or just the Mesoamerican version of a garden gadget phase. Still, the image is delightful, a salad bed on a slow cruise. Back in reality, the mess of reeds you're staring at is deceiving. Beneath that chaos is a kind of rhythm. Aztec farmers worked in measured, deliberate lines. They marked out rectangular plots using stakes driven into the lakebed, then wove them together with reeds and branches like assembling a soggy quilt. Mud dredged up from the lake floor was heaped on top layer by squishy layer until it formed a thick, spongy mat of soil. The process was, in a word, messy, but effective. You step onto one of these early experimental plots and feel it give slightly under your weight. Not sinking exactly, just breathing. It's alive in a way that most gardens aren't. Water seeps through the base, feeding the roots from below. The soil stays cool. The crops love it, and bonus, the gardeners don't have to worry about irrigation ditches drying up. The water's already here. It's underfoot, and somehow your sandals are still dry. One farmer crouched beside his bean smiles at you as if to say, "Told you so." The genius here isn't just in the floating, it's in the fix. The Aztecs didn't just tolerate their watery fate. They optimized it. They turned every challenge into a layer of compost, figuratively and literally. You pause beside a pile of old tools, stone-bladed hoes, reed baskets, and what looks like a paddle that's seen better days. Nothing fancy, nothing gold-plated, but effective. The technology here is lo-fi, but the design thinking is advanced. There's something oddly modern about it, actually. Closed-loop systems, self-watering beds, waste repurposed as fuel. If someone pitched this at a startup conference today, they'd be called a genius. The Aztecs just called it breakfast prep. By now, the air is thicker with the scent of growing things. Tomatoes dangle like lazy ornaments. Corn stalks rustle in the breeze, whispering secrets to one another. And somewhere off in the reeds, a duck snorts in its sleep. You rest your hand on the soil and feel its warmth, not dry, not hot, but cradled. Like it knows its job and is doing it well. The marsh may have started as a problem, but by the time you lie back and look up at the sky, you realize it became the empire's garden. You blink slowly in the warm morning haze, the damp earth cradling your weight like a well-worn hammock. Around you, the landscape is a grid, rows and rows of carefully tended rectangles like some sleepy patchwork quilt stretched across the shallows of Lake Xochimilco. These are no accidental plots. These are Chinampas, and what you're looking at is ancient urban farming with absurdly good real estate waterfront, lake-fed, pest-resistant, and somehow still not muddy. The reason your feet remain miraculously dry, the Aztecs didn't just toss dirt on floating mats and hope for the best. No, they engineered a system, one of balance, one of buoyancy. One that, unlike your last attempt at assembling IKEA furniture, actually stayed upright. And that's largely thanks to something you might call anchored ambition. You roll onto your side and examine the edge of the plot. Long, straight wooden poles extend down through the water driven deep into the lakebed. These stakes act like pegs securing the Chinampa, so it doesn't just float off in the night like a rebellious lily pad. They're often made of willow or cypress trees that are flexible, strong, and suspiciously good at staying upright in soggy conditions. Some of these trees are still alive, their roots hugging the underwater soil, their trunks forming natural fence posts around each garden. Over time, the trees don't just stabilize the Chinampas, they become part of them. And here's a curious tidbit: some of these support trees, called ahuejotes, were planted intentionally to act as windbreaks and soil anchors. But they also became habitat for birds' shade, for crops and occasionally perches for Aztec teenagers sneaking out for secret rendezvous. Historians still argue whether these trees were first used for their stabilizing properties or their sweet shady vibes, but either way, they became an iconic part of the landscape. You shuffle toward one of these tree-lined borders, dragging your fingertips through the cool water between the chinampas. These narrow canals are the veins of the system passageways for canoes, runoff control routes, and occasionally romantic cruise lanes. In your head, you imagine a lake-based Uber system where you summon a canoe with a well-timed wave and get paddled gently to the cornfield. 5 stars, no shoes required. The canals also solved a huge logistical problem. How do you manage a massive city like Tenochtitlan, which had an estimated population of 200,000 at its peak, without overloading the roads? Easy. Just use water. Everything tools, seeds, food gossip traveled by canoe. And because chinampas were everywhere around the city, you could reach a fresh tomato or a gossiping neighbor within minutes. It's basically farm to table minus the traffic. You glance behind you as a canoe glides silently past. In it sits a boy, about 10 years old, expertly balancing a basket of squash while steering with his knees. It's an early delivery run, and you get the feeling he's done this 100 times before breakfast. Probably still more coordinated than you. You wander a little farther along the chinampa's edge, past rows of beans climbing up poles, squash spreading wide like lazy cats, and maize, always maize, rising above it all. Corn wasn't just a crop here. It was life currency and calendar all rolled into one tall stalk. The Aztecs measured seasons by it. They named gods after it. They built ceremonies around it, and they baked it into tamales, which you could argue is the most sacred part of all. But even corn has needs, and those needs include nutrients. The Chinampa system was ahead of its time in soil sustainability. The Aztecs dredged up fertile muck from the lake bottom, silt algae and organic goo, and spread it across the plots like a nutrient smoothie. It was messy work. It smelled like low tide and regret. But it kept the soil rich, the plants happy, and the gardeners proudly ankle-deep in legacy. Oh, and let's not forget the fish. See, while you're admiring the top layer of this system below the surface, something else is happening. Fish dart between the roots of the ahuejotes. Tiny invertebrates nibble on decomposing plant matter. It's not glamorous, but it's efficient. The canals doubled as aquaculture ponds, and farmers often used lakeweed as both compost and feed. Some chinampa plots may have even been subtly designed to encourage this multi-level productivity, a kind of 3-tier food system where you could harvest fish, grow crops, and compost weeds without ever leaving your canoe. Historians still debate the exact yield of a mature chinampa plot, but by most estimates, these floating gardens produced multiple harvests per year. That's not a typo. You could get 7 crops of corn in a year if you timed things right, and didn't mind sweating through a lot of sunrise hoeing. But with all this productivity comes structure. The Aztecs didn't just eyeball their planting schedules. They used a sophisticated agricultural calendar that combined lunar and solar observations with ritual practices. Certain days were better for planting beans, others for harvesting squash. Some days just bad vibes altogether, maybe go feed the ducks instead. You lie back and close your eyes for a moment. The sun's rising higher now, filtering through the sparse leaves above. Somewhere nearby, a farmer sings softly, his voice carrying over the water like a lullaby for the plants. It's not ceremonial, exactly more like a habit. Something passed down from grandmother to grandson. Something meant to keep rhythm with the world. That's the thing about chinampas. They weren't just efficient or brilliant. They were intimate, built by hand, planted by families, floated on memory and mud. Every stake driven into the lakebed was an act of commitment. Every harvest a gentle promise that this strange, soggy land was in fact home. And your feet still dry, which, given the circumstances, feels almost like magic. You push off from the edge of the chinampa, and the canoe drifts forward with a lazy glide. The paddle in your hands feels worn smooth like it's been passed through 100 generations of calloused fingers. You dip it into the canal and send ripples sliding across the water's glassy surface. This isn't a race. It's more like a floating daydream. Ahead, the sun climbs over the distant volcanoes, but the air is still cool and soft. Mist curls at the edges of the canals, and dragonflies flit about like tiny gossiping fairies. The Aztecs didn't just farm the Chinampas, they lived with them. And that's exactly where you're headed now, toward the daily rhythm of life on these floating plots. On the next Chinampa, a woman crouches near a row of amaranth, gently inspecting the tiny leaves. You recognize the plant. It was a staple crop alongside maize and beans, used in everything from ceremonial cakes to hearty stews. It's rich in nutrients, but more importantly, it grows with a kind of delicate determination, almost like it knows it's feeding an empire. She's not alone. There are 3 children helping, or at least pretending to. One carries a bundle of herbs, another seems more focused on chasing frogs. The third is very earnestly talking to a chicken. It's unclear who's winning that debate, but the chicken looks unconvinced. These family plots weren't just work zones, they were intergenerational classrooms. Farming wasn't a chore you learned in school. It was life every hour of the day. You learned by doing, by watching, by accidentally stepping in duck droppings and being scolded for the 3rd time this week. What's more, Chinampas were often passed down through families like heirlooms made of mud. Ownership was a little fluid. Some plots were communally managed under the Kalpuli or neighborhood group, while others could be privately worked. Historians still argue whether land rights leaned more toward inheritance or local consensus, but either way, you didn't just own a Chinampa. You nurtured it. You drift past another plot where 2 elderly men sit cross-legged weaving reed baskets. Their hands move without hurry, without error. The reeds were harvested from the lake edges earlier that week, soaked and softened. Now they'll be woven into containers for cornmeal tools or, if you're unlucky, mosquitoes. Yes, sometimes these baskets doubled as mosquito traps. You leave that one to the professionals. Farther along, a boy tends to a plot of medicinal plants. He hums tunelessly while gathering leaves of epazote, a sharply scented herb that the Aztecs used to treat parasites, and flavor beans, which, let's be honest, sometimes amounted to the same thing. You lean over and inhale the scent, sharp, earthy, and vaguely suspicious, like herbal tea that's also judging your life choices. It wasn't all crops either. You pass a Chinampa where gourds are growing in tidy rows, some already drying into tough-skinned vessels that will later be turned into cups, ladles, or even flutes. Nothing was wasted. Even the plant that gave you lunch could also carry your water or provide music at the firelight ceremony. You begin to notice something else too, how quiet it is out here. Not silent, but soothing. The sounds are gentle frogs plunking into water leaves, brushing together in the breeze, the occasional squawk from a heron as if it forgot its line in a play. And somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat faints steady like a heartbeat just beneath the surface of the world. The Aztecs believed music and rhythm kept the universe balanced. Even farming had a musicality to it. Ceremonies were held to mark planting and harvest seasons, often with dancing songs and offerings. There were songs for rain, songs for corn, songs to ask forgiveness from the earth. Historians still debate whether these rituals were practical scheduling tools or sincere spiritual expressions, but either way, they gave structure to the day. And while you might expect ancient farm life to be backbreaking, unrelenting toil, the Chinampa system created a kind of gentle abundance. The soil rarely needed following. The water regulated temperature. Multiple crops could grow together in companion arrangements, like the famous trio maize for height, beans for nitrogen, squash for shade. It was farming with friends. You paused to watch an old man sharpening a wooden tool, a kind of digging stick called a koa. Unlike heavy European plows, the Aztecs didn't rely on beasts of burden or iron tools. Instead, they used what was available and what was needed. A sharp stick, a knowing hand. maybe a few grunts of encouragement. It was enough. A nearby woman waves to you and points toward a small fire at the corner of her plot. She's cooking something and your stomach reminds you it hasn't eaten in about 500 years. As you paddle closer, you catch the scent, steaming tamales wrapped in corn husks, filled with beans herbs, and just a whisper of chile. The smell is comforting and mischievous, like it knows you're trying to sleep and it's not going to let you. You sit with her, and she hands you a tamal with a smile. Her hands are strong, weathered, and stained with soil. She tells you this plot was her mother's and her grandmother's before that. The lake has changed, she says. The canals are narrower, and the frogs are quieter. But the corn still grows, the beans still climb, the songs are still sung. You eat slowly, the soft mesa warming your fingers, the flavors simple but somehow profound. You're tasting memory. Somewhere out beyond the mist, the city of Tenochtitlan bustles with temple construction and market day noise. But here on the water, time glides like your canoe, steady, serene, and maybe just a little too relaxed to worry about being productive. And as you lean back and the boat eyes half-lidded, the canal rocks you gently. You could get used to this life barefoot, tamal fed afloat on ingenuity. The canoe drifts on, nudged softly by your paddle, past more shinampas, stitched together like a patchwork quilt of vegetables, flowers, and memories. The water smells faintly of wet earth and growing things, the kind of scent that makes your shoulders drop an extra inch just from breathing it in. Now you notice something peculiar along the edges of these floating fields. Rows of straight, narrow trees, tall and slim, with silvery green leaves fluttering in the breeze. These are ahueyotes, or Mexican willows. They're not just decoration, they're the unsung heroes of the Chinampa system. You coast along the muddy boundary of one of these plots, and from your low angle, it becomes clear these trees are anchoring the whole garden in place. Their roots stretch into the lakebed like fingers gripping a ledge holding the Chinampa, steady through flood storms and the occasional awkward canoe parking job. Think of them as natural rebar with better shade. Historians still debate whether the use of ahuejotes came from careful ecological planning or happy accident. Either way, they serve multiple purposes. Their roots stabilize, their leaves compost, their branches become construction material. Plus, they provide perches for the neighborhood herons who contribute to pest control in that glorious, slightly alarming way birds do. You reach out and touch one of the trees as you pass. The bark is soft, ridged, and cool, a bit like petting a damp sweater left out too long, but in a good way. Next, you steer the canoe toward the edges of the Chinampa network. Here you can see how these floating plots were built from scratch. It starts with finding the right spot in the shallow lake. Stakes are driven into the mud to outline a rectangle, kind of like marking off your very own squishy aquatic real estate. Then comes the layering lake sediment, rotting vegetation, more mud-woven reeds, even a few old food scraps if no one's looking. It's a compost lover's fever dream. The result is a rich, spongy base that seems to feed itself. And since these plots sit just at water level, the roots always have access to moisture, no irrigation required. It's farming, but with built-in self-care. You glide past a young man on a smaller boat. He's pulling up aquatic weeds with a rake and tossing them onto a drying mat. These weeds, once dry, will be added to the Chinampa soil to boost fertility. Yes, in a twist that would make your compost bin blush, even Lake Gunk gets a second career here. There's a rhythm to all this, a cycle. Weeds become soil. Soil grows maize. Maize becomes tortillas. Tortillas fuel farmers who collect more weeds. It's a closed-loop system that's somehow both low-tech and wildly sophisticated. And it works. Some modern studies suggest that an acre of Chinampa could feed more people than most industrial farms today. Let that sink in while your coffee machine struggles to make you one decent cup. Farther along, you spot a raised plot mid-construction. A group of workers, shirtless, laughing, feet muddy, are hauling buckets of sludge from the canal. They pile the muck in a controlled heap, shaping it with shovels and baskets. It looks like the world's squishiest bake-off. One man waves a worm at his friend in triumph, and they both laugh. This is nutrient gold, you realize. Lake bottom sludge is the secret source of the Chinampa Empire. Rich in nitrogen, packed with microorganisms, and squishy enough to make even a sleep-deprived toddler squeal. It wasn't all idyllic, of course. Insects were a constant nuisance. So were water snakes. And occasionally the floating edges of a Chinampa might slump or collapse, especially during heavy rains. Some accounts mention repairs done at odd hours, guided only by torchlight and creative swearing. But the system endured, adapted, and grew, which is more than most gym memberships can say. You pull the canoe to a gentle stop at the corner of a plot half covered in bright marigolds. They're not food, they're offerings, used in ceremonies, celebrations, and honoring the dead. The air here smells faintly sweet and spicy, like old memories baked under the sun. A woman kneels nearby, arranging the flowers into a loose pattern across a low altar. Beside her, bundles of incense cornmeal and cacao pods wait their turn. You catch a few whispered words, not to you, but to the spirits she's inviting. Perhaps the spirit of a grandmother, or a god, or the lake itself. The Aztecs believed in sacred reciprocity. You didn't just take from the land, you gave back. Offerings weren't just ritual, they were part of the agricultural cycle. A harvest without gratitude was like a meal without salt, possible but bland. Historians still debate how much of these practices were top-down impositions from priests versus grassroots traditions. But in daily life, the lines blurred. Everyone in some way participated in the ongoing conversation with the earth. Back in your canoe, you close your eyes for a moment and listen. The sounds are small but layered, the whisper of reeds, the splash of a fish, the occasional mutter of a distant farmer who's just dropped something important and muddy. The air grows warmer. A fly buzzes lazily past your ear and then mercifully decides not to land on your forehead. You shift in your seat, let your hand trail in the cool canal, and realize something important. They built a world here not just of mud and maize, but of cooperation, of observation, of doing things the slow, careful, satisfying way. And somehow they managed to keep their feet dry. A little farther down the canal, the hum of daily life wraps around you like a warm blanket. You pass a family preparing lunch on a Chinampa, a few clay pots steaming gently over a fire, and the unmistakable sound of a tortilla being flipped by hand. The smell of roasted maize drifts across the water, mingling with hints of fresh herbs and the distant waft of something slightly fermented. Delicious, maybe. Mystery, definitely. By now, your feet have gone numb from being so comfortable, which is ironically perfect for this part of the story, Aztec food. Not the dramatic feast day sacrifices or giant banquets you may have read about, but the actual, boring daily meals. The ones that fueled the farmers, fishers, weavers, and canal paddlers like yourself. The cornerstone maize. Always maize. Ground into dough, cooked on comals, pressed into tortillas, or fermented into a slightly fizzy drink called chicha. Think of it as Aztec Gatorade minus the neon colors and suspiciously vague flavor names. You'd have your maize with beans, squashed chilies, maybe some amaranth if you were feeling fancy. It was the holy trinity of Mesoamerican cuisine, nutritionally complete, spiritually significant, and pleasingly mushy when stewed for hours. Historians still argue whether maize spread as a miracle crop because of its versatility or simply because it was the one thing that would grow everywhere Aztecs needed it. Either way, it got the job done, especially when paired with something foraged wild greens, mushrooms, or even the occasional aquatic snack. And that brings us to the lake's more adventurous menu items. You paddle past a boy scooping something into a flat basket at the water's edge. At first, it looks like algae. And it is kind of. Spirulina, to be exact. This greenish, foamy goo was collected from the lake surface, dried into cakes, and sold in the market as tequit latl. Think lake hummus, packed with protein a little fishy, and probably acquired taste temperament 14 on your list. Then there's the axolotl, Yes, that squishy, smiling salamander that now adorns plushies and Instagram feeds. The Aztecs knew it as food, delicate, slippery, and reportedly delicious when roasted in banana leaves. Still something about eating a creature that looks like it's permanently going through an existential crisis might give you pause. You turn your gaze upward as a heron glides overhead. On nearby chinampas, more crops emerge. Tomatoes, chilies, prickly pears, and herbs, with names that roll off the tongue like a sleepy lullaby. Epazote, hoja santa, papalo. Some for seasoning, some for medicine, and some for both, depending on how your day was going. The culinary world of the Aztecs didn't stop at the ingredients. They had a word, tlacualistli, for the whole ritual of eating, from preparing to serving to sharing. Meals were communal, often eaten seated on mats served from communal bowls. You didn't grab a burrito and hustle off. You sat, you dipped, you took your time. A kind of sacred slowness modern food courts could learn from. One of your paddles bumps against a floating basket. Inside, what looks like tamales wrapped tight in corn husks and tied with fiber. Steam curls from them. A woman nearby chuckles, picks one out, and offers it with a smile that suggests she's seen your paddling technique and finds it endearing if questionable. The tamal is warm, soft, filled with pumpkin and beans. The flavor is simple and comforting, like the edible version of a bedtime story. You chew slowly, and it occurs to you that food here is never just food. It's ritual rhythm memory. You can taste the lake in it. Near the center of one chinampa, a small structure comes into view, a kitchen open on one side, its thatched roof shading stacks of clay vessels. A woman grinds maize on a metate, the rhythmic shh-shh of the stone, rubbing another layer of narrative into the morning. Next to her, a younger girl stirs something in a pot with exaggerated focused tongue poking out slightly in concentration. You've seen that face before, maybe in your own kitchen when you try not to spill coffee while pretending you're on a cooking show. The kitchen smells of nixtamalized maize, a process of soaking corn in lime water that makes the nutrients more digestible. It's science and tradition all in one step. Historians still debate whether the widespread use of nixtamalization was discovered through experimentation or passed down from earlier Mesoamerican cultures. Either way, it was genius. Without it, maize diets would have caused severe deficiencies. With it, strong bones and happy bellies. You pass a few boys fishing with hand-woven nets. One pulls up a catch and laughs as a squirming amphibian flops dramatically, then escapes with what might be an obscene bubble. They groan, splash each other, and return to their task. Dinner isn't caught easily. Even in paradise, you have to work for your tacos. But then, surprise, there were no tacos. Not the folded kind you imagine now. No cheese, no sour cream, and absolutely no drive-through window. What you'd get is more like a maize pancake topped with stew eaten open-faced or rolled if you were on the go. And you didn't scarf it down while checking your calendar app. You'd savor it, laugh between bites, maybe pause to feed your dog or admire a bird landing on your roof. The sky has begun to dim slightly now. Shadows lengthen over the chinampas, and your little canoe drifts beside a stall selling spices and dried herbs. You smell cacao, dark, bitter, and divine. Not your corner store chocolate bar, but the earthy, sacred version used in Aztec ceremonies and medicine. It wasn't always sweet. Often it was blended with chili and served hot, frothy, and confrontational. Like a spa treatment for your tongue, if your spa also offered mild emotional trauma. You watch as the vendor lifts a carved gourd and pours the drink from a height, letting it splash dramatically into another vessel. It froths beautifully. A performance in a cup. You sip and everything slows again. You glide quietly now through narrower channels where chinampas rise like sleepy green islands, stitched together with wooden walkways and soft-voiced chatter. The lake has taken on a bronze tint in the sun's waning glow, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke and water hyacinth. You ease your paddle into the water, pushing past lily pads that bob like little floating plates and drift toward a spot where children gather near an elder. She's telling a story, one that sounds like a folk tale, but woven into it are details so specific, so agriculturally accurate. You wonder if this is how farming tips are passed down here through bedtime legends and giggled retellings. You pause and listen. It's about a man who angered the rain god Tlaloc by planting chili peppers upside down. The punishment, a year of cabbages and nothing else. Terrifying. You smile because here we are talking about farming. But make no mistake, this is no ordinary backyard gardening story. The Aztecs and the peoples before them turned the Valley of Mexico's soggy basin into an agricultural marvel, without industrial tools or tractors, just mud willow branches and a whole lot of trial and error. To build a chinampa, you'd first mark off a rectangle in the shallow lake bed using wooden stakes, usually from fast-growing trees like ahuejotes, the friendly willows you've been seeing everywhere. These weren't just markers. Their roots helped hold the soil in place, and their canopies offered just the right amount of shade. Smart right. Then came the mud. Thick, dark lake mud hauled up by canoe and layered with decaying vegetation reeds and other organic matter. Over time, this pile would settle and solidify into an artificial island more fertile than your average patch of farmland. These beds were narrow, often only 2 to 4 meters wide, but long, sometimes up to 100 meters. They were separated by canals wide enough for a canoe, making transport and irrigation effortless. You're starting to get it now. This wasn't just farming, it was an early form of permaculture. The Aztecs engineered a whole microclimate. Water constantly surrounded the chinampas, regulating temperature, keeping roots moist, and even protecting against frost. Pests had a harder time getting established, and crops could grow year-round in a sort of lake-fed greenhouse effect. You could harvest 7 times a year if you timed it right. Historians still argue whether chinampas were a purely Aztec innovation or adapted from earlier cultures like the Xochimilca, who inhabited the region centuries before the Triple Alliance ever flexed its muscles. Either way, the Aztecs refined the system to its peak and managed to feed a city of hundreds of thousands. You spot a young farmer now knee-deep in mud at the chinampa's edge, pulling up a plant that looks vaguely like spinach. He smiles, shakes the earth from the roots, and moves along, leaving footprints that fill with water before your eyes. His companion, a girl about your age, give or take several centuries, follows behind, with a flat basket strapped across her back. They make a silent team, but the rhythm between them is clear. Pull pass, plant pat. The girl pauses to look up at the sky, lips moving in what might be a prayer or a recipe. She touches the earth gently, no dramatic gestures, just a small moment of connection, maybe gratitude. You wonder if this is part of the secret. Not just the engineering, but the relationship to the land. The kind of respect that turns mud into magic. Nearby, another farmer tends to what looks like a living compost pile. It smells earthy and fishy. You realize it's a mix of lake sediment ash from cooking fires and organic waste, maybe even crushed bones or bits of shell. Rich stuff used to replenish the soil between plantings. And no, it didn't come in a bag from a garden center with a cartoon worm on it. Occasionally, you'll see someone dragging a long pole with a claw-like scoop at the end. These are Coe's tools for stirring up the lakebed muck, which would then be scooped and slathered across the chinampa surface like frosting. Disgusting frosting, yes, but frosting nonetheless. Sometimes they'd even mix in fish guts or excrement. You're not sure whether to be impressed or mildly alarmed. One boy shouts and waves you over to a chinampa, where he's just found a toad with the face of a priest, he claims. You paddle closer, and sure enough, the creature does look unusually judgmental. It croaks once and hops away. The boy shrugs, returns to his planting, and mutters something about omens. You don't know if it's a good one or bad. But honestly, in this place, even the toads seem sacred. By the time you pass another cluster of chinampas, you've spotted a dozen different crops, not just maize and beans, but tomatoes, chili peppers, sunflowers, and even cotton, yes, cotton, which grew here for textile production, as well as ritual use. Its tufts dangle from their stems like little clouds waiting to be plucked and spun into tunics. The sky is streaked with peach and lavender now. A heron flies low across your field of view. A boy whistles back at it, and for a moment, you're not sure who initiated the conversation. The lake exhales, or maybe it's just your own breath slowing. A woman appears at the edge of one chinampa, holding something small and furry. No, not a dog. A muskrat, a water opossum. She lowers it gently into the water, and it swims off with an awkward, flailing charm. Maybe it's a pet, maybe it's pest control, or maybe it's none of your business. And as the light fades further, fireflies begin to blink lazily across the reeds. Their rhythm is irregular, soothing like the lake whispering good night, one dot at a time. The night settles softly over the chinampas, a gentle velvet drape peppered with stars you'd swear twinkle just a little slower here. You feel the cool breeze ripple the surface of the water, carrying scents of wet earth and blooming lilies. Your canoe rocks gently, lulling you closer to sleep as you drift along the narrow channels that weave between these floating gardens. But there's still one more mystery to explore: the ingenious irrigation and water management systems that kept these chinampas thriving. Because you might think that a lake is just a big puddle of water, but for the Aztecs, it was more like a carefully choreographed aquatic symphony. You begin by noticing the dike's low earthen walls, carefully built to separate the brackish lake water from the freshwater canals. These weren't just random mud piles. They were finely engineered barriers that prevented salt water from invading the chinampas, which would have been a nightmare for crops. The dikes also controlled water levels, ensuring the plants weren't drowning or parched. Here's where the willow trees come back into the picture, their roots acting like natural reinforcement to hold the dikes together. No expensive landscaping contracts, just nature's own builders on the job. The Aztecs understood this balance deeply. Too much water and the plants drowned. Too little and they wilted. You imagine standing barefoot on one of these dikes, feeling the cool mud beneath your toes, hearing the gentle splashes as fish dart between roots and reeds. Fish, by the way, weren't just swimming around for fun, they were an essential part of this ecosystem. The Aztecs used a system called milpa fishing, catching fish, in ways that complemented the chinampa agriculture, without disturbing the delicate balance. Historians still argue whether the fish served primarily as a food source or as a natural fertilizer, since their waste would add nutrients to the water. Either way, you can't help but appreciate the Aztecs' sophisticated understanding of aquatic ecology. They weren't just farming, they were farming smart. As you drift under a canopy of branches, you notice a man tending to a small channel that looks like a natural moat. He's adjusting a wooden sluice gate controlling the flow of water between the lake and the canals. The sluice gates allowed water to be raised or lowered to suit the needs of specific crops, a kind of ancient irrigation tech that would make any modern gardener nod in approval. This system was remarkably efficient. Rainwater, lake water, and canal water were carefully managed to ensure that every plant got just what it needed. You can almost hear the water's gentle sighs as it moves through the network, calm, steady, reliable. You recall reading that the chinampas were so productive that they could yield up to 7 crops a year compared to the 1 or 2 typical on dry land farms. 7, that's a lot of tortillas. And considering that Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was home to hundreds of thousands, it's no wonder these floating farms were considered a marvel of the ancient world. You spot a group of women washing clothes at the canal edge, their laughter mingling with the soft slap of water. Among them is an elderly woman who carefully tends to a basket of sprouting herbs, whispering something to them as if coaxing them to grow. It's a gentle reminder that this whole agricultural wonder was also a community affair tied into daily life and shared routines. Yet despite all this ingenuity, historians still debate how much of the Chinampa system survived the arrival of Europeans and the destruction that followed. Some say it was almost wiped out. Others argue it persisted quietly for centuries, hidden in plain sight. What's clear is that this method of farming shaped not just the Aztec Empire, but the land itself. As the moon rises, its silver light sparkling off the canal waters, you lean back, letting the gentle rocking soothe you. The floating gardens seem to breathe with you a living, watery quilt woven from soil roots and history. And as you close your eyes, you realize that you've drifted through a landscape where engineering meets art, where nature and human hands dance in perfect harmony, and where the past whispers, softly inviting you to dream. The dawn's early light slips softly through your eyelids, warming your face like a gentle promise. You open your eyes to a horizon tinged with pinks and soft golds, and the chinampas around you begin to stir with a sleepy kind of life. Birds chatter quietly from the branches of willows lining the canals, and somewhere nearby, a rooster announces the day with an enthusiastic, if somewhat out-of-tune crow. You're back in the daily rhythms now, the quiet patient, work that turns mud and water into meals and memories. You watch as farmers, already dressed in simple cotton garments, dyed in soft earth tones, move across the Chinampas, like dancers on a stage, their movement steady and practiced. They're harvesting maize and beans, carefully cutting stalks and sorting kernels into woven baskets. What's fascinating is how the Aztecs didn't just grow food to survive. They cultivated plants with ritual medicine and even beauty in mind. You spot a patch of bright marigolds, their orange petals glowing against the green backdrop. These flowers weren't just decorative, they played a role in religious ceremonies and were believed to have protective properties. A bit of ancient floral feng shui, you might say. Nearby, a woman crushes dried herbs into a small bowl, mixing them with water to create poultices and teas. Aztec medicine was surprisingly sophisticated, using plants like epazote and copal to treat ailments ranging from stomach troubles to spiritual imbalances. You're reminded of the surprising overlap between farming and healing the soil, nurturing both body and soul. Historians still argue whether certain plants, like the magical Teonanacatl mushrooms, were used solely for ritual purposes or also medicinally. You smile, thinking how that debate probably sounds like a euphemism for did they throw ancient psychedelic parties. Either way, these gardens were a living pharmacy. Walking along a canal edge, you see children playing a simple game involving balancing on thin wooden beams over the water, their laughter echoing softly. Their carefree joy contrasts with the focused work of their elders, but it all feels part of the same gentle flow of life on the Chinampas. You pause by a cluster of sugarcane stalks, tall and swaying sweet-smelling in the morning air. Sugarcane was a luxury crop used to sweeten drinks and offerings, but not grown everywhere. It's a reminder that even in this practical farming system, there was room for indulgence. One farmer, humming softly, tends to a patch of chili peppers. You watch as he delicately picks a bright red one, holding it up like a tiny fiery trophy. Chili peppers were central to Aztec cuisine and culture, fiery, bold, and unforgettable. You wonder how many dishes you'd dare try if you lived here. Probably not the ones with the extra spicy warning label. Just then, a curious duck waddles up, eyeing the baskets with what you assume is considerable interest. The farmers chuckle and toss it a few grains of maize. It's moments like these, the unexpected companions, the quiet camaraderie that make this ancient world feel oddly close to your own. As the sun climbs higher, warming the air and chasing away the last chill, you think about the incredible resilience it must have taken to maintain this delicate balance of water, soil, and life. Every day was a negotiation between nature's unpredictability and human ingenuity. You spot an old man carving a wooden figure from a willow branch, its shape still rough, but unmistakably a representation of a water spirit. It's a reminder that for the Aztecs, agriculture was never just about survival. It was wrapped in myth-belief and a deep connection to the land and water. You drift on the gentle sounds of life weaving around you, a world suspended between earth and sky, mud and water, past and present. The afternoon sun drapes the Chinampas in a warm, honeyed glow, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and ripening maize. You step lightly along a narrow path bordered by reeds, feeling the subtle give of the soil beneath your sandals. This is a place where time slows, where each moment folds softly into the next, like a whispered lullaby from the ancient lake itself. Your thoughts turn now to the labor behind this lush beauty, the ingenious techniques that made such productivity possible. You notice farmers using long wooden poles to gently turn the soil, loosening it without disturbing the fragile network of roots and waterways. This careful tending kept the Chinampas fertile for generations. One curious detail catches your eye, the use of human hair as a binding material. It sounds odd, maybe even a little gross, but in truth, this practice highlights the Aztecs' resourcefulness. Hair was collected braided into mats and used to stabilize the soil along the edges of the Chinampas. It acted like a natural erosion control, preventing the precious dirt from washing away into the canals below. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or more localized, but the idea of hair-powered farming adds a touch of humanity quite literally to these floating islands. You picture an entire community contributing strands of their hair, weaving invisible threads of connection between themselves and the land. Nearby, you spot a man stirring a thick mixture of mud and crushed shells, preparing a natural lime plaster. This plaster wasn't for walls or buildings, but to reinforce the Chinampas' foundations, sealing tiny gaps and helping the soil hold together against water currents. The Aztecs were masters of using what the lake offered, turning even the smallest resource into a farming tool. You lean in to examine a patch of corn tassels, golden and delicate, swaying gently in the breeze. Corn or maize was the lifeblood of Aztec agriculture, revered as a sacred gift from the gods. Farmers carefully selected seeds from the healthiest plants to ensure bountiful harvests, a practice resembling modern seed-saving traditions. On the edge of the Chinampa, you spot a small structure made of reeds and wood, a humble yet effective greenhouse of sorts. Here, farmers nurtured seedlings before transplanting them to the floating plots. This early form of controlled growing space helped protect young plants from pests and the intense midday sun. As you walk past, a faint, sweet melody drifts through the air, a woman humming a traditional tune as she works. Music and song were woven into daily life, softening the toil and linking people to their ancestors. You wonder what stories those songs carried, whispered across the rippling waters. The afternoon wears on and the shadows lengthen. You feel the comforting weight of history pressing gently around you, as if the Chinampas themselves are leaning in to share their secrets. You catch sight of a small group of workers constructing a new Chinampa, carefully layering soil reeds and branches. It's a slow, meditative process requiring patience and skill. Watching them, you realize this was more than farming. It was a form of artistry, a collaboration between people and nature that created a living, breathing landscape. Historians still debate the exact methods used to anchor these floating gardens permanently, whether by driving wooden stakes into the lake bed or relying on natural root systems alone. Either way, the ingenuity is undeniable. As the day fades into evening, you find a quiet spot among the reeds, letting the gentle sounds of water and rustling leaves soothe your thoughts. This is a world of balance between labor and leisure, water and earth, ancient wisdom and everyday life. And as the stars begin to appear, blinking softly above the lake's glassy surface, you feel yourself drifting again, carried by the calm, enduring spirit of the Chinampas. The evening wraps the Chinampas in a soft blanket of twilight, the air cooling and carrying the faint chorus of frogs and insects waking for their nightly serenade. You settle on the edge of a canal, watching the water catch the last hues of the sun, pink lavender, and a deepening blue that seems to stretch into forever. As the world quiets down, your thoughts wander to the social rhythms that shaped this watery landscape. Farming wasn't just a solo act, but a communal dance where families, neighbors, and even entire districts worked together. The Shinampas were a patchwork of shared effort woven tightly by custom and necessity. You observe groups gathering near a communal fire, their faces lit by flickering flames. Stories and laughter mingle with the crackling wood, and you realize that the Shinampas were as much about community as crops. Labor was shared. Knowledge passed down and celebrations tied closely to the cycles of planting and harvest. One tradition you learn about involves the ritual blessing of the Shinampas before planting season. Priests would sprinkle water from the lake, recite prayers, and offer small gifts to ensure a prosperous yield. The connection between the spiritual and agricultural worlds was seamless. A delicate balance you feel in the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle splash of water. You smile at the thought of these ceremonies, a kind of ancient Zen moment where hope and humility met. It reminds you of that crocodile dung sunscreen story from earlier as practical and peculiar all at once. Historians still argue how much these rituals influenced crop success versus practical farming knowledge. It's a reminder that sometimes belief and biology coexist in the most fascinating ways. As the fire's glow dims, you turn your attention to the food prepared for the evening meal. Simple, nourishing dishes made from the day's harvest. Maize tortillas, bean squash, and the occasional bit of chili pepper, all flavored with wild herbs picked from the Shinampa's edges. You imagine the taste earthy, fresh, and satisfying in a way that only homegrown food can be. The preparation of meals was another moment of quiet ritual, a pause to honor the land and the effort that made the feast possible. Nearby, children settle in with woven mats, ready to hear tales of gods and heroes, of creation myths that explain how the lake and Chinampas came to be. These stories, you realize, were not just entertainment, but lessons in identity and survival. You watch as an elder begins to speak his voice, low and soothing, weaving images of hummingbird serpents and the legendary founding of Tenochtitlan. The myths ripple through the group like gentle waves connecting past and present. The night deepens and you find yourself lulled by the soft cadence of the storyteller's voice, the gentle lapping of water, and the warm glow of the fire's last embers. It's a moment suspended in time, a perfect balance of nature, culture, and community. You close your eyes, feeling the calm embrace of this ancient world settle around you like a soft quilt. Night deepens over the Shinampas, a velvet curtain dotted with stars stretching endlessly above you. The gentle murmur of water lapping against the reed-lined banks blends with the soft calls of night birds, creating a lullaby that feels as old as the lake itself. You lie back on a soft patch of moss, the cool earth beneath you grounding and comforting as if the land itself is whispering a secret. Your mind drifts to the ingenious irrigation system that made this floating paradise possible. The Aztecs designed a delicate balance, fresh water from the lake mixed with nutrient-rich mud, dredged from below cycling nutrients through these living islands. You imagine the endless scooping and layering, the careful placement of branches, reeds and earth to build each Chinampa layer by layer. One intriguing tidbit, some Chinampas were created atop ancient wooden platforms, remnants of earlier civilizations' efforts to cultivate the lake. It's like a patchwork quilt of history, each layer built upon the last. You wonder if those first gardeners ever imagined their work would echo through centuries, still supporting life long after their hands were gone. Historians still debate how much manual labor was involved versus natural sediment accumulation in forming Chinampas. Either way, it's clear these islands were living systems, dynamic and ever-changing, much like the people who tended them. As your thoughts wander, you recall the role of birds in maintaining the delicate ecosystem. Birds nested in the reeds, their droppings enriching the soil, naturally an early example of sustainable farming, centuries before the term existed. It's a reminder that in this watery world, humans and nature weren't adversaries, but partners. You think about the unique biodiversity that flourished here, frogs with their choruses, colorful dragonflies darting through the air, fish weaving between roots beneath the water's surface. This wasn't just farmland. It was a vibrant ecosystem, humming with life. Near the water's edge, a small fire flickers, tended by a solitary figure preparing a simple evening tea infused with herbs known to soothe the mind and body. You imagine the scent, mild earthy, with a hint of sweetness, a natural invitation to unwind. It's striking how these gardens combined practicality with care, each element thoughtfully chosen to nurture not only crops, but also well-being. The Aztecs weren't just growing food, they were cultivating a way of life. You let your breath slow, syncing with the rhythmic sounds of the night, feeling your eyelids grow heavy as the chinampas cradle you in their timeless embrace. The dawn gently nudges the chinampas awake, soft light spilling over the water like liquid gold. You find yourself back on the narrow paths, dew cooling your feet, the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers weaving through the air. The world feels fresh, like a whispered promise, inviting you to explore once more. Today, your attention turns to the crop variety that made the chinampas so famously productive. Beyond maize and beans, you notice squash vines sprawling lazily, their bright blossoms adding dashes of orange and yellow to the green canvas. The Aztecs practiced what we'd now call companion planting, growing crops in combinations that helped each other thrive. One fascinating detail is the use of chili peppers, not just for spice, but as natural pest deterrents. The fiery little fruits warded off insects and small animals, protecting the precious yields. You smile at the thought of these tiny guardians standing guard over the gardens. Historians still argue about how widespread these techniques were, especially if they evolved independently or were borrowed from neighboring cultures. Either way, the complexity is impressive, a harmonious orchestra of plants working together. You wander toward a shaded area where herbs grow thick and fragrant, mint, epazote, and marigold, each chosen for medicinal or culinary uses. It's easy to imagine how the people here relied on these plants, not only for food, but also for healing and ritual. Nearby, you see a man carefully harvesting fresh watercress, its peppery leaves glistening with morning dew. Water plants were just as important as those rooted in soil, offering both nourishment and a place for aquatic life to flourish. You recall that the chinampas' design helped reduce waterborne diseases by keeping water moving and oxygenated a sort of ancient public health measure. It's remarkable how these gardens supported not only agriculture, but also community well-being. A curious fringe fact surfaces: some Aztec farmers decorated their chinampas with small carved stones or painted reeds, perhaps, to honor the gods or simply to brighten their daily work. It's a sweet reminder that even in practical tasks, there was room for beauty. As you move through the gardens, the gentle hum of insects fills the air, a soothing white noise that lulls you toward calm. The birds add their soft calls, a soundtrack to the slow, deliberate rhythm of life here. You find yourself thinking about the balance between human ingenuity and nature's generosity, between work and rest, between survival and art. The sun rises higher, casting dappled light through leaves and reeds, and you feel the peaceful pulse of this world settling deep into your bones. The day begins to wane as soft shadows stretch across the chinampas, the air carrying a gentle warmth tempered by the promise of evening. You stroll along the winding canals, the water reflecting clouds, drifting lazily above like fluffy pillows on an endless sky. The calm here feels almost hypnotic, as if time itself flows more gently over these floating islands. Your thoughts turn to the ingenious methods used to protect the crops from both natural and human threats. The Aztecs built small fences from woven reeds and branches, not just to mark territory, but to keep out animals and curious neighbors alike. These simple barriers blended effortlessly into the environment, a quiet guard without harshness. An interesting tidbit: some chinampa farmers trained dogs to help protect the fields, much like watchful sentinels with wagging tails. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, teamwork extended beyond humans. Historians still debate how formalized these protective measures were and whether they varied across different parts of the lake. But what's clear is the constant vigilance required to maintain such a delicate ecosystem. You pause to watch a small heron stalking the shallows, its slow, deliberate movements almost meditative. Birds like these thrived alongside the gardens, playing a role in controlling pests, naturally part of the balanced cycle you've come to admire. Nearby, a woman carefully tends a cluster of flowers, planted for their pleasant scents and believed spiritual properties. Marigolds, known as flower of the dead, held special significance linking the physical and spiritual worlds, a gentle reminder of life's cycles. The evening meal is being prepared close by a simple feast of beans, maize tamales, and fresh herbs. The smell of cooking drifts toward you, mingling with the damp earth and fading daylight, an aromatic invitation to rest. You reflect on the remarkable longevity of Chinampa agriculture, thriving through centuries of change and challenge. Their resilience speaks to a deep understanding of nature's rhythms and a respect for balance that modern farming often overlooks. As night falls, fireflies begin their silent dance, flickering like tiny stars come to earth. The water mirrors their glow, doubling the magic in this tranquil world. You settle back, feeling the gentle pulse of the Chinampas sinking with your own slow breaths. This place, born of water and ingenuity, holds a timeless calm, inviting you to rest, to dream, and to float softly into sleep. The final twilight descends softly over the Chinampas, wrapping the landscape in a hush that feels as gentle as a whispered lullaby. You sit quietly on a wooden dock, the cool air brushing your skin as you gaze out across the still waters, now dark and glassy, beneath a sky littered with stars. The soft croaking of frogs and distant calls of owls weave together, creating a soothing soundtrack that seems tailor-made for drifting off. You think back over everything, the ingenious construction of these floating gardens, the vibrant life they supported, the rituals and rhythms of the people who nurtured them. It's humbling to realize how this delicate balance was maintained with such care, each element playing its part in a larger living tapestry. There's a fringe idea that some Chinampa farmers may have used early forms of compost tea, liquid fertilizer made from fermented organic matter, to boost their crops. Whether this is fact or folklore, it adds a dash of earthy magic to the story of these gardens. Historians still debate how the Chinampa system evolved after the Spanish conquest. Some believe it declined rapidly, while others suggest parts survived well into the colonial period, quietly enduring beneath the changing tides of history. You take a slow breath, feeling a deep connection to this place and its people, who harnessed water and earth with patience and ingenuity. The Chinampas were more than gardens. They were a testament to harmony, resilience, and the human spirit's gentle power. As you lean back, the cool night air whispers through the reeds, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. Your eyelids grow heavy, the calm settling in like a soft blanket around your shoulders. It's time now to let the world slip away, to surrender to the quiet rhythm of the lake and the slow pulse of ancient life beneath the water's surface. You close your eyes, heart full, and float softly into sleep, carried by the gentle waves of history. The soft murmur of the water lulls you deeper, each breath slower, heavier. The stars above twinkle like distant campfires, comforting and steady. You feel the cool breeze as it sighs through the reeds, a soothing reminder that you are safe, cradled by time and tide. Let your thoughts drift like the Chinampas themselves, floating effortlessly on the lake's embrace. Allow your mind to rest, your muscles to unwind, your heartbeat to slow to the gentle rhythm of the night. In this quiet moment, all worries melt away. There is only peace, only calm, only the slow, steady dance of water and earth beneath an endless sky. Sleep well, dream deeply, and wake renewed.